Come now to our first meeting at the Arkansas Camp 1981, and this is 7:30 on Friday evening. Now this evening I thought that I would more or less make an introductory address to acquaint you with the ground we shall cover as the week goes by. In other words, I plan to give the whole camp meeting in this first meeting in very short form. The idea of that being that someone suggested to me if I did that, folk would have a clear view before we start of just where we're going. And then during the week, of course, we can fill in the details and develop the various arguments and thoughts and truths that attend these particular points we shall be covering. I'd like to mention, first of all, that we do meet at a very important time in this world's history, and that there have been developments during the year which I think are quite significant. One has been the very powerful attack made against the spirit of prophecy by Walter Wright, Des Ford, and his compatriots. These men are charging Sister White with being a plagiarist. A plagiarist, of course, in simple terms, is a person who borrows from the writings of others while at the same time claiming that the whole thing has been their own work and nobody else's. Now, there are various claims and counterclaims in respect to this. I'm not going to attempt to answer the charges this evening. I just want to make one specific point, and that is the objective of these charges, of course, is to weaken confidence and faith in the spirit of prophecy. The basic argument being that Sister White claimed to receive her messages by direct inspiration from God. And we believe that. In fact, one cannot read a book like Desire of Ages without realizing that this is not the work of a human mind. This is very obviously the far superior inspiration which comes down from above. Now, I will mention the fact that one needs but to look into major encyclopedias such as Britannica or Collier's and those to find that against the Bible is laid the same charge. Moses, for instance, is charged with getting the flood story not by inspiration but from the writings of Babylonians. As you probably know, of course, there are throughout the various nations of the old world, that is Babylonians, Assyrians, Egyptians, the cultures in Peru and Central America, flood stories that obviously are records of what took place back in Noah's day. To a certain extent, these agree with the Bible record, but because they are the product of heathen minds, because they've been handed down as a tradition from generation to generation, they have become quite distorted and unreal in certain aspects. But the point is, of course, that the leading men of the world charge Moses with being a plagiarist. They say he got all this information not by inspiration but by reading the Babylonian, Egyptian, Assyrian and other records. Oh, I shouldn't mention Babylonian because in Moses' day, of course, Babylon didn't yet exist. It was to come at a later period. The Chaldeans did, but not yet the Babylonians. Now, I've found over the years that every charge which can be laid against the spirit of prophecy can also be laid against the Bible. So we find ourselves in the position where if we reject the spirit of prophecy on one of those charges, the Bible has to go too. For the very simple reason that the same charges can be made against the scriptures as can be made against the spirit of prophecy, which is to be expected, inasmuch as they are both, of course, from the same source and have pitted against it or them the same enemies, namely Satan and his agents. Now, what interests me, of course, is this, that Sister White says in Selected Messages, Volume 1, that the very last deception will be to make of none effect the spirit of prophecy. The very last deception. And so with this development, we find that the spirit of prophecy is being made of none effect. And as surely as that is so, we are entering into that period when the very last deception in human history is being perpetrated. And that means, of course, we're coming right down to the very end of time. Now, this shouldn't surprise us because there are 3 statements in the book Great Controversy which tell us in explicit terms that 6,000 years will have elapsed between the rise of sin and the second advent of Jesus Christ. And not for one moment, of course, will I dare to teach any kind of time setting. We can't assess from these statements the exact date for Christ's second coming, for the very simple reason that we don't know exactly how many years have elapsed between now and creation. But this much we have to know: 6,000 years have come very, very close to being terminated. I read from Great Controversy, page 658 and page 659. First of all, page 6, I beg your pardon, this page, I'll read page 659 first. I'm just missing the statement for the moment. It says here, for 6,000 years, before I read any further, the statement is written at that point, or describing that point of time when Christ has come back to this earth, the righteous have been raised, and at that point of time, Sister White says, for 6,000 years, Satan's work of rebellion has made the earth to tremble. He has made the world as a wilderness and destroyed the cities thereof. And he opened not the house of his prisoners. For 6,000 years his prison house has received God's people, and he would have held them captive forever, but Christ has broken his bonds and set the captives free. Now just prior to this, I think on the previous page, I thought it was, apparently it wasn't, there's another statement which says the same thing, that for 6,000 years the great controversy has been in course of progress. When those 6,000 years is terminated, then Jesus Christ shall return in the clouds of heaven once more. Here it is on page 656. A noise shall come even to the ends of the earth, for the Lord hath a controversy with the nations. He will plead with all flesh, he will give them that are wicked to the sword. For 6,000 years the great controversy has been in progress. That is, at this point of time, not today, but at this point of time when this statement, which the statement describes. And that point of time, of course, is that point when Jesus Christ appears in the clouds of heaven. So there are three separate statements which plainly declare that for 6,000 years the great controversy will have gone on by the time Jesus Christ returns. Now, as I said, we can't pinpoint that exact year, but one thing is very, very clear: that year is not very, very far away. This means, of course, that time is growing indeed very, very short, and very soon we shall find ourselves plunged into those experiences which are described in Revelation chapter 18, and which we generally term the loud cry, which comes as a result of the outpouring of the latter rain. When that time comes, we have no concept of the experience that we're going to have, when it's a combination of celestial glory from above and persecutions from beneath. Let's read these words in volume 9 of the Testimonies, page 16, which reads as follows: The worshippers of God will be especially distinguished by their regard for the fourth commandment, since this is the sign of God's creative power and the witness of his claim upon man's reverence and homage. The wicked will be distinguished by their efforts to tear down the Creator's memorial and exalt the institution of Rome. In the issue of the conflict, all Christendom will be divided into two great classes: those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus, and those who worship the beast in his image and receive his mark. Now, having described the kind of people involved in this, Sister White talks about the conflict between these two classes. A little further back on the same page it says, Satan is a diligent Bible student. He knows that his time is short, and he seeks at every point to counterwork the work of the Lord upon this earth. Now comes a statement. It is impossible to give any idea of the experience of the people of God who shall be alive upon the earth when celestial glory and a repetition of the persecutions of the past are blended. They will walk in the light proceeding from the throne of God. By means of the angels there will be constant communication between heaven and earth, and Satan, surrounded by evil angels and claiming to be God, will work miracles of all kinds to deceive, if possible, the very elect. Now, Sister Wright says, it is impossible to give any idea of the experience of the people of God who shall be alive upon the earth when celestial glory and a repetition of the persecution of the past are blended. Now, that's our future, if we're faithful and true to God and to His truth. Of course, at the same time, we recognize that there is an increasing loss of respect in the Seventh-day Adventist Church for the great fundamentals of the sanctuary truth. And when that goes, of course, then Adventism is certainly no longer Adventism, because the sanctuary is the very heart of the great Second Advent message. The world itself, of course, is getting ready. There's no question about that. In fact, it is ready for the last great scenes of this world's history. We don't need to comment upon that fact. The world is only waiting for the church to get ready, and then the last scenes will come upon us in very, very rapid succession. So we meet this year at a time when the theme of this week's meeting, which is preparation, is a very, very appropriate one. Now, those who have been here year after year know that every year the Lord gives to us a fresh and wonderful revelation of truth. Let's just cast our minds back over the past few years, for instance. We think of the message that God gave us on His very, very wonderful character. We call this, of course, Behold Your God, in the book written about it. We learned there the vast difference between the real character of God and God as most men view Him. We read with comfort and assurance the statement which says that at this time, Christ Topic Lessons, page 415, right down at the close of human history, there would be revealed a message from God which would be illuminating His, transforming His power and illuminating His nature. God's character would be revealed. And that this is the very last message of mercy ever to be given to perishing mankind. That's Christ Object Lessons, page 415. This theme was followed by the law in Galatians and the message on true medical missionary work. We moved on then to a study of the book of Daniel, which was our theme last year. I'd like to mention, of course, that very obviously those folk who have come to the camp year after year were much more at home with these themes than those who come for the first time. Now, of course, we'll be very much aware of your newness amongst us, and we'll do our very, very best to fill in the gaps by taking some studies, no doubt, during the week to fill in the gap between what we're teaching now and what we have taught in the past. Now, last year, I think as we went to the book of Daniel and saw the incredible faithfulness and marvelous success experienced by that man of God, that we did raise the question during the week, how was it that Daniel received the kind of character, the kind of abilities, the kind of steadfastness which enabled him to stand when others in like positions have fallen and made some very, very bad mistakes? At that point of time, the answer was left, or the question was left unanswered. We didn't volunteer or bring forward a reply to that particular question. Now, during the year, in God's own good time and way, the answer to that question has come through, and we find it to be an extremely important and impressive answer. And the first part of our week will be devoted to the work of preparation through which God took Daniel in those years prior to his captivity in the land of Babylon. A study of that period, of course, is extremely important because we recognize that today we are likewise being prepared to fill the same position in the final warfare against Babylon that Daniel occupied back there in the original warfare against Babylon. Now let's just review in our minds tonight a little bit of what we saw last year in respect to the book of Daniel to compare that with the present situation in which we are today. Daniel's life is divided into two parts. The part we studied last year, of course, was conflict and victory. And that occupied that point of time when he went into Babylon around about the year 606 BC, right down till the fall of Babylon. Beyond that, until his death at some time in the kingdom of Medo Persia. That's the part we dealt with last year. Now, last year we saw how Daniel was but a youth of 18 years of age. And by the way, I found a statement in volume 4. I'll look it up for you later. I've just forgotten the page at the moment. I think it's page 440 or thereabouts, which says that Daniel was 18 years of age when he went into Babylon as a captive or as a bondman. And that, of course, is a very tender, inexperienced point of life. He wasn't yet what you'd call a matured man by any manner of means. He wasn't yet developed in strength of character to the point where one could expect him to stand. He was just a youth, inexperienced, uncertain, unsure of himself in many respects, no doubt. And Daniel and his three friends found themselves in direct confrontation with the mighty king of Babylon. And the king of Babylon was determined to bring them under his power and to integrate them with the Babylonian system. But in every single confrontation between the king of Babylon and Daniel or his three friends, as the case may be, came off absolute victors. They were the winners in every such struggle, in every such battle. Now, we saw last year why this was so, and it was because in Daniel's life, Christ only remained as the head over him as the member. We saw how that Daniel never allowed himself to be the plan maker, the burden bearer, or the problem solver. That role was left to God and to God alone. And because God has 1,000 ways that we know nothing about in which to solve our problems, and because God had Daniel's problems, then of course Daniel never knew what it meant to be a failure or to be defeated. He only knew, he knew no such thing as failure, impossibility, or defeat. As Desire of Ages, page 490, promises will be the experience of those who are true and faithful to God. They'll never know any such thing as failure, loss, impossibility, or defeat. Now, obviously, of course, in order to achieve that kind of victory, Daniel must have had some kind of a very, very thorough preparation. So prior to that, that battle, that conflict and victory, there was a very, very thorough work of preparation which went on in the life experience of Daniel. And last year, I think we might have suggested this was the work of his parents. This year, we will read statements to show it was somebody else, although, of course, the parents did play a very, very important part in that work of preparation. Now, because today we are facing in the near future the rise of Babylon the Great, so this is Babylon's day. It was so back in Daniel's time, and once again today we have Babylon the Great, of whom we read in Revelation chapter 18. And this will be the final manifestation of the man of sin through earthly agencies. And there is to be a conflict between God's two people, few in number though we shall be, and the mighty king of Babylon, and this time will gain the final and absolute and permanent victory over this enormous force in the world. Now that event, or that period of time being just before us, then what period of time are we in at the present moment? Preparation, very obviously. Now the preparation that God provided Daniel back in those days is the exact preparation that God must provide his people at the present time, right? Therefore, the preparation through which Daniel went has to be to us a very, very important study, because we shall thereby learn and recognize what God is doing at the present moment of time in our preparation. And we'll come to recognize too that the preparation is not something which any human mind has put together, but it's the preparation which God himself had organized. And we shall learn that the architect for Daniel's success was not his parents, although, as I said before, they did play an important part. But the prophet Jeremiah was a specific instrument through whom God conveyed to Daniel the prophet the great principles of Sabbath rest, and taught that youth, that man Daniel as a boy, a very young boy, I'll demonstrate how that Daniel was born after the ministry of Jeremiah began. We'll demonstrate from God's word how that Jeremiah travelled to the homes of people like Daniel's parents, and how Sister Wright specifically says that Daniel learned from the prophet Daniel such lessons as enable him to stand like a rock with unswerving faithfulness in the court of the king of Babylon. So Jeremiah now emerges as an extremely important figure in the history of God's church. The full extent of his ministry, of course, is not really apparent to us at the present time, but, and I don't suppose ever will be until we arrive in heaven and see the full effect of what that man did under God's personal direction and blessing. Right now we'll take just one text from Jeremiah, chapter 10, verse 23, to demonstrate how thoroughly this man understood the principles of God's Sabbath rest. Jeremiah 10 and verse 23. Now, of course, a basic principle in respect to God's Sabbath rest is the recognition in clear terms of man's position in relation to God's position. And we've stressed the fact again and again that God is the source, Christ is the connector, but what is man? A dependent receiver. Right, man is a dependent receiver. And the reason why God is the source is because only He has the capacity to be the source. And man must remain a dependent receiver because he does not have in himself the capacity to be anything else. And when men begin to assume that they do have those capacities, then they are already guilty of self-exaltation. They're already becoming self-sufficient. They are already beginning to walk apart from the God of heaven. Now Jeremiah, in chapter 10, verse 23, expressed man's condition and his awareness of his own condition in these very, very straight and plain words. He says, O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself, it is not in man that walketh to direct his steps. It's just not there. Now Jeremiah might have said, O Lord, the way of man is not in himself. Now would that have been as strong as saying, O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself? Which is stronger? The way it's written, isn't it? He's expressing a very deep and profound conviction. In the book Ministry Hearing, page 478 and page 479, we have the Spirit of Prophecy's counterpart of Jeremiah's statement, where Sister Wright says, page 478, we have not wisdom to plan our own lives. It is not for us to shape our future. Page 479, let God plan for you. And that states, of course, man's position. We do not have the wisdom to plan our own lives. It is not for us to shape our future. If we start to plan our own lives, if we start to become the problem solvers and the burden bearers in God's work, then what are we doing? We're taking God's place and we're building what force? The papacy, right? Now, no one can fight the papacy by building the papacy, can they? Impossible. So therefore, when Daniel entered the court of Babylon, he could not successfully fight Babylon with Babylon's principles. And he didn't. He fought them with God's principles. And whereas, of course, the very way of Babylon was to make man to be the plan maker, for man to rule over men, yet Daniel met that system in the court of Babylon by letting God and God alone be the plan maker for him, and so he gained the victory. Now we'll be drawing some very important comparisons between Jeremiah's day and our own. We will recognize, of course, that Jeremiah's day was a day of very deep, what word do you suppose I shall put next? Apostasy. Was it not? And that apostasy began back in the days of Solomon, when, bent upon building up God's kingdom, Solomon turned to his own devisings, his own plans to organize and build up the kingdom of God. In other words, he went about building up God's kingdom by his own ways or his own methods. And once again, That is, of course, the way of the papacy. And so I'll quickly find you a statement here in the book Prophets and Kings, which makes this point, page 54. It says, as inclination gained the ascendancy over reason, self-confidence increased, and he sought to carry out the Lord's purpose in his own way. That was the key to Solomon's apostasy. He sought to carry out the Lord's purpose in his own way. We learnt last year, of course, we have to carry out God's plans in God's way. Now, coupled with that misstep on Solomon's part, which Sister White said was so fine to begin with, so gradual, that the king did not recognize that he was moving into strange paths, there came the loss of clear perceptions of divine truth. Now the Bible says in John, the 8th chapter, you shall know the truth and what? Right, the truth shall make you free. So first of all, there was a deviation from God's ways in the building up of God's kingdom. Secondly, there was a loss of the fine perceptions of gospel truth. And thirdly, Sister White says, we shall learn, we study this in detail, there came the loss of the spirit of self-denial and the spirit of self-sacrifice. And those three things, those three factors were introduced into Solomon's life, and of course through him into Israel, then the apostasy had begun. Now we shall be comparing from Testimonies Volume 1, that starting back shortly after 1844, the church began to drift into a condition of apostasy, a very deep apostasy. Now we say this, of course, without any malice or condemnation. We simply express this as a fact that we have to face, no matter how distasteful that fact might be. Because most certainly we would like it to have been a very, very different history. But facts are facts and we have to face them. And naturally, of course, when we think in terms of something which happened 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, more or less, a little bit less than I guess, 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, we are so emotionally separated from that point of time that we can calmly and candidly investigate that apostasy back in Solomon's day without there being any emotional reaction. But when it comes down to our own present time, and it deals with a situation involving friends, loved ones, parents, children and so forth, or long-standing church associations, then what tends to interfere with clear reasoning? Emotional involvement, right? But we must try and put that aside and look at the thing face to face, exactly as it is, to face facts as they are, and to appreciate the situation as it is. Now, in Volume 1, we'll demonstrate, by simply reading the testimonies, that after 1844, the same factors which caused the downfall of ancient Israel caused the downfall of modern Israel. The same factors precisely. And that brings home to this little group in this room tonight, or will bring home to us, I hope it does, the solemn realization that we are in danger of making the same mistakes. We have no reason to feel superior to generations of the past. Satan is a very cunning foe. He knows the natural weaknesses and tendencies of human nature, and you can be very, very sure he'll bring to bear upon us as the days and the weeks go by the same pressures precisely as he brought upon those folk back there so successfully, generation after generation. Therefore, our awareness today of what caused the apostasy back in Solomon's day is a revelation of Satan's tactics. And if we know what Satan's tactics are, then does this give to us a decided advantage? Very decided advantage. In fact, Sister Wright says there's nothing which Satan fears so much, amongst other things, of course, that we will become aware of his devices. And if we become aware of his devices, then we can put up our guard and our defences and be protected against the insinuation of this wily foe. So then, we will study the rise of those two great apostasies, and we'll search our own hearts to find out if the same things are already becoming entrenched in our experience today. And if they are, let's take very decided steps to get rid of them. We'll spend some time studying the message of Jeremiah, what he actually taught the people. This will take several study periods from the first chapters of this great book. And we will be impressed, I think, with the clarity and the power with which that man understood and taught the principles of entering into God's Sabbath rest. Now, possibly, to begin with tomorrow morning, we'll give a short study on God's Sabbath rest, so when we use this term, again and again, those who are new amongst us will know what we're talking about. We'll take the book of Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, and also the book of Deuteronomy, Numbers, and look into the way in which Israel did not know God's ways and therefore did not enter into God's rest. They will then develop, having looked at Jeremiah, we'll then go back and look at these 3 points again: doing God's work in our own way, the loss of the perceptions of spiritual truth as it is given to us at the present time or any other time in history, and particularly at the principle of self-sacrifice being the life of the church. There is a statement from Desire of Ages right now from page 21, I think it is. No, page 20. Page 20 in the book Desire of Ages, where Sister Wright is describing the powerful bond which holds all created beings together in the sinless worlds. Then she talks about the fact that page 19 to 20, both the redeemed and the unfallen beings will find in the cross of Christ their signs and their song. It will be seen that the glory shining in the face of Jesus is the glory of self-sacrificing love. In the light from Calvary, it will be seen that the law of self-renouncing love is the law of life for earth and heaven. That the love which seeketh not her own has its source in the heart of God, and that in the meek and lowly one is manifested the character of him who dwelleth in a light which no man can approach unto. And the statement plainly says the law of life. Now the law of life is that law which guarantees life. In other words, guarantees the continuation of life. So the law for the continuation of life in earth and heaven, not just earth but heaven as well, is the principle of what? Self-sacrificing love. Now, while the church has in it the spirit and the principle of self-sacrificing love, that church will prosper spiritually and materially too. It will draw others to the Saviour, link them with the cross of Calvary, and fit them for a place in the eternal kingdom. But when that spirit starts to die out, when material possessions become more important than building up the cause of God, then that is when death enters into a church organization, and the result can only be dismal apostasy. And we'll be developing that point quite strongly as the week goes by. And that will lead into the next area of study, which we're titled, of course, Why God Does Not Always Heal and Why God Does Not Always Save from Death. Now, the tendency is to teach the simple idea that all sickness is the outworking of sin. But that's not true. I suppose if we were to say to the average person, true or false, make a statement such as, all sickness is a result of sin. That is sinfulness in the life of the sick person. What most folks say. True. But it's not true. I guess I said that too a little while ago, but I came to understand from studying the book of Job and the life of John the Baptist and Lazarus in particular, that sickness and death is not always the result of a person's wrong habits of living. Because people who have gained the victory over sin and are living very righteously and very, very close to God are permitted by God to be afflicted by the devil. Let me read this to you now from page 1140, volume 3 of the Bible Commentary. And the statement from the pen of inspiration is as follows. There is wickedness in our world, but all the suffering is not the result of a perverted course of life. That's clear, isn't it? I'll read it again. There is wickedness in our world, but all the suffering is not the result of a perverted course of life. There's a second cause apart from that. Job is brought distinctly before us as a man whom the Lord allowed Satan to afflict. The enemy stripped him of all he possessed, his family ties were broken, his children were taken from him. For a time his body was covered with loathsome sores, and he suffered greatly. His friends came to comfort him, but they tried to make him see that he was responsible by his sinful course for his afflictions. Now, Job knew better than that. In fact, Job clearly understood the principle that not all sickness is caused by a man's own sinful course of life. Now, of course, very certainly, if a man is living a sinful way of life, what will he get? Sickness, that's for sure. But it is not safe to reason that because a man does have sickness that he therefore must be living a sinful course of life. So let's put these two lines of reasoning now. First of all, if a man is living a sinful life, it is logical to reason he'll get sick and die. That's clear, isn't it? But if a person gets sick and dies, you can't immediately assume, although it might be true, but you can't assume that this means that he has been living a sinful life. In the case of Job, those 3 or 4 comforters, so-called comforters who came to see him, they knew he was sick, and what did they promptly assume? That he was living a very, very sinful life. But Job knew better, and he said, no, that's not true. I am not living a sinful life. I'm a righteous man. I do keep the commandments of God, and therefore my sickness is not the result of sin, it's the result of Satan afflicting me because of his malice and hatred against the cause of God. I read further now from the statement, page 1140 in volume 3. But he defended himself and denied the charge, declaring, miserable comforters are you all. By seeking to make him guilty before God and deserving of his punishment, they brought a grievous test upon him and represented God as in a false light. But Job did not swerve from his loyalty, and God rewarded his faithful servant. Now we'll develop from the life of Job, the life of John the Baptist, the life of Lazarus, this very, very beautiful principle that whereas God would like in his great love to preserve us from suffering and sickness and death, because of the nature of the great controversy and because of the blessing that we will gain by participating in the sufferings of Jesus Christ, God does at times permit the devil to afflict his faithful children. Therefore, while it is true that the more wicked you are, the more sick you're going to get, it is also true that the more righteous you are, you're likewise in great danger of becoming sick and dying what may appear to us to be an untimely death. Now we'll move on from this theme to the closing theme of the week, which will be based upon the statement in the book Education, talking about the experience of Christ and the relationship which communion with God had with the life of Christ. Now in the statement, page 80 of the book Education, which reads as follows, it talks about the life of Christ, and it says, as he went about doing good, every day's experience was an outpouring of his life. An outpouring of his life. When you take a life and pour it out, what do? You deplete your resources, don't you? You literally deplete them. Now I'm going to stress the point later in the week that when you spend your life, or I better say expend your life in service to God, not service of your own choosing, but service of God's direction, God's choosing, and you find that you become weary, exhausted, and spent, then there's nothing unnatural about such a condition under those circumstances. And this is proved by the fact that Jesus Christ himself became so utterly wearied at times that his mother and his brothers and even his disciples feared that his life would be sacrificed. I'll read that to you from the book Ministry of Healing in this very wonderful chapter entitled With Nature and With God, and I'll read from page 55 in this particular volume. It says, often his incessant labour and the conflict with the enmity and false teaching of the rabbis left him so utterly wearied that his mother and brothers and even his disciples feared that his life would be sacrificed. So first of all, we are to face the fact that service for God is going to expend our energies and deplete our resources physically, mentally and spiritually. All three phases of human experience. Now obviously then we're either going to die from working in God's cause, or we're going to have some form of replenishment, some form of resupply. Naturally, of course, we'll tend to think, well, a vacation, a rest in bed, a good sleep, a cessation of work for a few days is going to give him back some restoration of his forces. But Sister Wright says in Education, page 80, in one way only could such a life be sustained. In one way only. All right. Now what's the kind of life that God expects us to live? The life of Christ. And what kind of life is that? A life of sacrifice or expenditure of physical, mental, spiritual and material resources. There's only one way in which such a life can be sustained. Now what is that one way? Do we need to know it? We certainly do. Because you can't live the life of Christ unless you understand how such a life can be sustained. How is it sustained? Sister White then describes the fact that we human beings very often repair to the throne of grace and a period of blessing follows. But Jesus Christ supplicated the throne of God till his humanity was charged with a heavenly current that connected humanity with divinity. Receiving life from God, he imparted life to men. And that's the secret of it. In other words, my basic statement is that Jesus Christ lived in dependence upon God and communion with him. Now here we have dependence upon two things. Christ depended upon God, that was one thing, but he also depended upon communion with God. In the first area, of course, God was his plan maker, his problem solver, his burden bearer. But in the second area, through communion with God, Christ depended upon that communion to restore to him that which had been expended in the ministry of healing that he performed day by day. So we'll be developing toward the end of the week the way in which we can learn, first of all, the necessity of communion, and secondly, of course, how to enter into that from day to day. Those then are the themes and the ground we plan to cover this week. You now have a mental picture where we're going. Of course, if the Spirit of God wills otherwise, there may be a change of direction during the week. I don't come with any fixed plans for a session of meetings like this, and the Spirit of God is utterly free to change the program if he wishes. But at the present time, that's my anticipation or expectation, and that's the direction in which the meetings took out there in California and also over in Europe. I will mention, of course, that very obviously preparation is never so interesting or exciting or inspiring as lessons on conflict and victory. So therefore this camp will not have quite the inspiration, shall we say, that we had last camp. And yet the folk out in California said that they were just as blessed this year as they were last, so perhaps I'm mistaken in making that particular observation. So I do trust as we go through these great themes that we'll all be richly blessed during this week and emerge from it much better fitted to face the devil and to fight the battles God gives us to fight in the final conflict with the man of sin. Time has now come to close, so we'll take our closing hymn. The closing hymn is number